Hey guys, what is up? It is Kristen with another video, and today we're going to be talking about File I/O. File I/O is going to be basically a similar concept to what we did in the last video about parsing strings. So let's take this as an example for something that would use File I/O. This problem basically says if you have a calculus midterm and grades are posted on the math department's website. Suppose there's a class with 20 students and that class has a roster with the names of the students and their test scores saved as a comma separated file or a CSV. You're asked by the calculus teacher to input the names of all the students and their test scores into a program to find the passing grades in the class. So this will require using File I/O, and we'll have to implement a split function as well. So let's dive right into this. So here I want to talk about some basic stuff about File I/O. So to use File I/O, we need to use strings to read data in from a file or out of a file, or both. So to use a stream, you have to include the fstream data type at the top of your include statements. Here we also have operators that can be used. These are the three most common used. Ifstream is the default for using fstream. It is the reading from a file only. For this assignment, I would recommend using this. OFstream is reading out from your program to a file if you were to manipulate a file and then output it to a file to be saved. And fstream can do both at the same time. And this is a very special case, but for right now, I would focus on using ifstream. So down here at the bottom, I have a simple way of making sure that you're declaring a stream and opening a stream. These are two steps that are really important. We're calling the ifstream, and we're naming it endFile because it's the input file. We are then using the .open function on endFile to open the function, and we are passing the file name into the .open function. So if you had a txt file, you would put a string in here for file name, similar to this .txt. You can also specify the directory path to your file in this as well if you have it stored somewhere else, not in the same folder. Okay, so let's look at an example of this class that has scored, that have test scores on the midterm. So with every line, you want to assume that this is, because it's stored as a txt file, it is a string line. So these are all characters, even though they have numbers and commas and spaces. And what we have here is basically one data piece that we want to store, which is a word on the line. Then we have a delimiter character, which is our comma. And then we have a second piece of data, which is an integer stored as a string, part of a string. So it is characters within a string. Okay, so I'm going to jump into some code that I built up here to show you how to do this. First of all, let's go over the split function that's going to be used to parse our data. So this split function that I have created takes note, please take note of the fact that the split function takes a string for the line that we want. So every time that we are reading a file, we want to think of every line as a chunk of data that we are going to manipulate in some way. We're going to parse it. So this string line is one variable that we'll have to pass in as a parameter, a char separator for our delimiter, a string myLineArray to store what we parse, and the size of that array. So notice that I have declared a temp box. So this temp box is kind of like a middleman in between what you are reading in and what you're going to store, the location where you're going to store it. I like to think of this kind of like as a bunch of boxes along a wall. And this box is kind of like a bucket that you can move items in between boxes. So say you have a bunch of packing peanuts. You can store all of the packing peanuts in a box, then scoop them out with the bucket and then put them into another box. So here we're checking to see if the line is empty. and we're going to return a different value if it is not what we want. The next line is we're going to add a separator character additionally to the last word. So just like what I was saying in the last video that we did, where we were talking about parsing strings, right? You want to make sure that there's an additional delimiter character at the end of the string in order for the last piece of data you want stored, actually stored. So the next thing I'm doing here is I'm reading through the string line using a for loop because I know the length of the string using the .length operator, and I'm using include string. All right, so here you can see that if the line is not equal to the separator, so as long as the character is not the comma, we're going to take the characters and store them into a temp box called temp line. Otherwise, if we hit this else statement, we have hit the delimiter because this would no longer be true. So when we're at the comma, what we want to do is take whatever is in the temp box and store it into our array of strings. So this will hold the temp strings that we are parsing. We're going to increment the operator, which is going to be a different variable for our array, and we're going to reset our temp box to an empty string for the next word. So this is the gist of what a temp function does. So let's go down and look at our file IO function now. And just to note, our main is just doing a cout statement on our read file function for its return of the passing grades that we have done at the end of our read file. So when I go in here to the read file, let's look at this. So here I have a variable for passing grades to keep track of the number of people who score over 70 on the test. I know that there are 20 students in the class, so I can set the size to 20 in this example. I've also declared my separator character inside of the read file function, knowing what it is in the comma separated file. And I've also got a temporary string for the line. I've also decided, since I know the comma separated file only has two different pieces of data separated by a comma, to create a temp array of size 2 so that I can store one piece of data at position 0 and the other at position 1. This makes it really easy to move things between locations in the computer. I also have a string array for the students' names and an array for the scores from their tests. These will both be set to the same size here because we know that they're exactly the same amount of scores as there are students. So the next thing I do on line 49 is I create the in-file IF stream. This is where I declare the stream. And in the next line here, I am opening the string and having the .open operator open students.txt, which is a txt file that I have saved in the same folder on Cloud9 as my program, my CPP file. So the first thing I'm going to do is check to see if InFile has failed to open the file. And if it has, I'm going to return -1, meaning that it would have failed to actually process the result. Otherwise, it has opened, and I have a counter here that I'm going to declare at the beginning of my otherwise statement, and I have a while loop set up to read the file. So the way that I'm doing this while loop, take note of the way that I'm passing the Boolean argument. So here is an example of how to use getLine. Some of you might have noticed that there is a difference between CN and getLine when reading in strings, because CN works best with individual pieces of data, while getLine can operate on whole strings and large sentences regardless of spaces or separator characters. So here, the while loop condition says, as long as there are lines in the file that can be grabbed from the stream, keep going. So this will continue to operate until the end of the file, as long as there are lines left to be read in with getLine. An alternative way that you could set this up is to set the while loop condition as an end of file argument. In this example here, you could say while it is not the end of file stream. So while we have not reached the end of in file, keep going. Inside of your while statement, you would have to do a getLine in file call as one of your primary ways of doing this. So it would be doing this in 2 steps instead of in 1. So whichever way you want to do it, you can do it. This is the most effective way as far as I can tell. Now, the first thing we're going to do inside of our while loop is we're going to check to see if there is a line that's empty. So if there is something there that we don't want, or the file is corrupted, or something that we can't anticipate happens, and it's not what we actually want, we're going to put it in an if condition here to check to see if that is so. And if it is so, if we have some piece of data there, we're going to go into this if statement. Inside of this if statement, we're going to call our split function. Now notice how I'm calling the split function. I call the function and I pass it line, which is the string that we have declared, the separator character, which we have declared, the temp array of size 2, and the size here as well. So if I was to compare this to the split function again, notice that the split function takes a line, a separator character, an array of some size, and its size. Now because of this, you can pass it multiple different things. This is a template function that can be reused for different sizes of data. So the next thing we want to do is we want to create a student names variable. So this is a temporary string box for whatever is stored in temp array 0. So if you were to think of the data, right, you'd have the name on one side of the comma at the 0 position, and then on the other side of the comma you would have the 1 position, which would hold their score from the test. We're doing the same thing here by creating an integer variable called student scores, and notice how we are converting it. We're calling the string to integer function and passing in our array of 1, where we know we have stored a score, which is a integer value stored as a character stored in a string. It's kind of like Russian nesting dolls. So here at students of I will equal the student names temporary box. So as we increment I in our while loop, we are going to take the names from the 0 position, store them into the temp box here, which is the variable, and then we are going to pass them into our array at position I. And we do the same thing for the scores of the students. So this is how we fill and populate our arrays using a while loop and I++ conditional iterator. We also reset the student names temp box and temp variable and scores temp variable to null values. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to output what I actually just stored in my arrays. So here in this for loop, I know that the size of both the scores and the students' names arrays is based off of size, so I'm setting this as I equals 0, I less than size, and it will loop through every student, print out their name and what they scored. I'm also doing a sub count here. If the scores at position I is greater than 70, so if the value in scores that we have stored is greater than 70 at any point when we loop through and print out the scores, we're going to increment pass and grade, which is a variable keeping track of the passing scores for this test. So the last thing, and this is something that's very important when you're doing file I/O, is to close your stream. It does not take any parameters, but if you do not close your stream, bad things can happen to your CSV file. Just don't do it. Remember to close your file. And the last thing I'm doing is I'm returning the passing grades variable counter. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. Okay. So what we have here is we have the names of all of the students and what their score was being output to us from this file.io function. And at the end here, when we return the passing grades variable to main, we can tell that 14 students have passed the test. Not all of them were over 70, and not all of them were under 70, but we have figured out how many have actually passed. All right, guys, well, that is a basic introduction to File.io. I hope this is helpful with your homework 6. Hang in there. I'll see you guys later.